You ready to go?
Hi everyone, welcome. We're just going to give you all a few minutes to log on and get settled, and then we'll get started. I'll just give it a few more seconds to let people get on. All right, well, I guess I will start it off. So hi everyone, my name is Lindsay Slaughterback. I'm a planner in Tallahassee, Florida, and I'm also a member of the APA Florida Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee. Today, we're excited to welcome you to our webinar, Addressing Gentrification and Displacement to Preserve AAPI Communities. We've been working with Hing and Todd from the Asian and Pacific Islander Interest Group from APA National, who you'll meet shortly, and we're very excited to offer this session. As for the EDI committee, we're a standing committee of APA Florida, but we're expanding our reach nationally. Just like this session here, we're reaching several time zones with this time. We're working to further equity, diversity, and inclusion in the planning field, and much of our work is focused on input we've received from planners in Florida. A shameless plug for some of our upcoming events include on the 14th of June, from 7:30 to 10 a.m. We're partnering with the Women Transportation Seminar Central Florida chapter to commemorate the anniversary of Juneteenth. On June 27th, we're doing an LGBTQ+ inclusion and representation and planning event. And then on the 29th and 30th of June, we're doing an upholding equity and planning workshop as well. So if you have any questions about those, please put them in the chat. And throughout this webinar, please put any questions in the chat. Todd will be moderating and he will give those questions to our panelists. At this point, we have a few poll questions that we would like you to answer, and then I will hand it off to Hing. Thank you.
So please take a moment to do this poll. The APA Asian and Pacific Islander Interest Group is honored to be able to sponsor this webinar to celebrate AAPI Heritage Month with the APA Florida EDI Committee. My name is Hing Wong, and I am the chair of the Asian and Pacific Islander Interest Group. According to the census, there are 24 million Asians and 1.6 million Pacific Islanders living in the United States. The AAPI community is the fastest growing racial group in the country, growing over 4 times as rapidly as the total US population, and it is expected to double to over 47 million by the year 2060. Our Asian and Pacific Islander Interest Group may be new, but we plan to be active in serving APA planners and our Asian and Pacific Islander community. If you're not yet a member of our interest group, this is a perfect time to join. Please go to the link that you'll see on the next background page and fill out our survey. Once you've completed the survey, you'll automatically become a member. There are no dues or fees for our interest group. The Asian and Pacific Islander Interest Group would like to increase the number of API in planning and support them in their career development, provide a forum for planners to better understand the needs and desire of API communities, and build a diverse network for all planners to share their experiences and ideas relating to API communities. So you see the link there on the bottom that has our membership poll. This session is being recorded and we will post it when available. For those who are AICP, you'll be pleased to hear that this event has been approved for 1.5 CM credits. At this time, we'll take a look at the answers to the poll that you just took. So we have almost 50%, 46% who are either Asian, Native Hawaiian, or Pacific Islanders, 14% who are Black or African American, 4% who are Latina or Latinx, and then 36% who are white or Caucasian. Okay, thank you. Todd Van Nadelock, Programs Director for our Interest Group, will be introducing our 3 speakers. Todd will also be moderating the Q&A session after all 3 speakers have presented. Todd?
Great, thank you, Hing. Again, my name is Todd Van Nadelock. I'm the Programs Director for the APA's Asian Pacific Islander Interest Group, and I'm also a planning consultant in Chicago. Now we'll introduce the 3 speakers who will share their experiences and insights on addressing gentrification and displacement to preserve Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. A friendly reminder, as Hing noted, is to share your questions for our panel speakers in the chat box. We will go through them in the Q&A after all 3 speakers have finished their remarks. So our speaker lineup today, we have 3 speakers. First, leading off is Anjan Chaudhry. Anjan serves as the Director of Community Empowerment for National Capacity, where Capacity, CAPACD, stands for the Coalition for Asian Pacific Islander Community Development. National Capacity is a coalition of about 100 community-based organizations from 21 states and the Pacific Islands. Their member organizations work in low-income Asian American and Pacific Islander communities to improve housing security and preserve our neighborhoods. Anjan was the lead author for National Capacity's Our Neighborhoods Initiative, which is a network of AAPI grassroots organizations committed to addressing the issue of gentrification neighborhood organizing. Anjan will share their experience with this initiative. In addition to organizing around housing and economic justice, Anjan is a strong advocate for LGBTQ rights. Next is Jenny Chen. Jenny is a community development practitioner and organizer committed to racial justice and building the capacity of organizations to create change in their neighborhoods. Jenny has worked with community development corporations and grassroots organizations in both Boston and Philadelphia, where she has planned and implemented collaborative efforts to address issues of public safety, gentrification, and food access. She serves as Equitable Neighborhood Development Coordinator for Asian Americans United in Philadelphia and is a leader with Viet Lead in the Philly, South Jersey region. Jenny has a master's in city planning from MIT, where she studied the impacts of housing policy on the lives of individuals and neighborhoods. And third on our panel is Edward Ng. Edward is a technical vice president of planning for the Corradino Group, which is a Miami-based engineering, planning, infrastructure, and environmental consulting firm. Edward is an active member of APA Florida, the APA Florida state chapter, including serving as a chair of the conference committee in 2021 and chair and vice chair of the Gulf Coast section. He holds a Master of Planning and Master of Public Policy from the University of Southern California, as well as a BA in Planning and Public Policy with a minor in Economics from Rutgers University. Edward will address the needs and challenges facing AAPI planners, including our role in community preservation. Please join me in welcoming Anjan, Jenny, and Edward. Anjan will lead us off.
Thanks, Todd, for that introduction. I'm so excited to just thank you so much for this opportunity to present. So to start off, hi everyone, my name is Anjan Chaudhry. My pronouns are he and they. And like Todd said, I'm here representing National Capacity. We're the Coalition for Asian Pacific American Community Development. And if we can go to the next slide, please. So a little bit about myself. I actually came to the work of National Capacity by way of housing organizing for 2 member organizations that are part of our coalition, Chaya CDC based in Jackson Heights, Queens, as well as CAV based in New York City, Chinatown, and also in Queens doing public housing organizing. And as Todd mentioned, I'm one of the authors of the Our Neighborhoods Toolkit and one of the conveners of the Our Neighborhoods Network. A little bit about National Capacity. So we were founded over 20 years ago by AA and NHPI leaders who were based with within the different community development organizations across the country and in Hawaii. Our coalition now includes over 100 organizations, including CDC, social service organizations, youth development groups, and organizing and advocacy organizations. So before I start my presentation, I also just wanted to start with a land acknowledgement. I'm calling in from occupied Piscataway and Nacotchtank land, also known as Washington, D.C. If you haven't already, I would just encourage you to find out more about the land that you're occupying and the indigenous peoples whose land it belongs to. And you can visit nativeland.ca to be able to do that. We'll share the slides back here so you can have access to the links from this presentation. So I'd invite you to learn more about the Piscataway Indian Nation as well as the Piscataway Conoy tribe to support land back efforts. So a little bit about the Our Neighborhoods Network. So we're a network, one of the projects of national capacity that's really focused on this issue of gentrification. To do this, we build power with low-income residents and youth who've been directly impacted by the issue of gentrification and displacement. We can go to the next slide. And so how we do this is we create spaces for cross-cultural connection and sharing across cities. So specifically, this work entails language justice work, including translation and dissemination of resources in different AA and NHPI languages. We developed the toolkit, which I think I'll also share a link in the chat, as well as doing work at the local, state, and national level around policies to protect AA and NHPI neighborhoods from gentrification. So why did we create this network? So some of National Capacity's research found that nearly 3/4 of low-income AA and NHPIs live in the highest housing cost cities and region. And so as a result, our communities are specifically at very high risk of displacement. And, just to give like a little bit of the historical context, when we talk about gentrification and displacement, I think one place to start is to just with the history of racism within the housing and community development field. And so when we talk about the neighborhoods, especially the different historic Chinatowns, Japantowns, Koreatowns, the different Asian neighborhoods, those were actually created not by choice, but really because often working class Asian immigrants were forced to live in these neighborhoods. And this was because of exclusionary housing policies such as alien land laws, which were passed in multiple states. I know we're partnering with the AAPI Florida chapter. Florida is actually was actually the last state to officially repeal one of its alien land laws in 2018, even though those were, formally made illegal by the Fair Housing Act. Other examples of exclusionary housing policy include attempts by San Francisco to ban the use of laundromats. And those were really those laws were specifically used to target Asian business owners. And so later on, the Supreme Court actually struck down those laws in the late 1800s. Many of these early Chinatowns were also, really faced a lot of violence, right? So examples include the Antioch and San Jose Chinatown were actually burned down. And so there's this history of really racist and xenophobic violence and people fleeing that violence as a reason why people have congregated together and built these neighborhoods to begin with. Displacement has also been part of our history. So an example is the I Hotel in San Francisco, where there were over 150 Filipino elders who were living in a housing development that were displaced in the 70s. So despite there being a blockade of organizers who tried to stop the eviction. There was a police riot and a lot of violence that displaced these residents. Another example, and this is from really an urban renewal project, was the Vine Street Expressway that was built that really cut Philadelphia Chinatown in half. And so you can see, as we're thinking about Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, really the history and legacy of the places where Asian Americans have lived, there has been this racist violence that has really shaped the places where our communities have been able to live. And so now in like the contemporary context, people are seeing these neighborhoods in a different light. And so they've become popular destinations for tourists, where people have wanted to come and eat different food, or, because of gentrification, a lot of these neighborhoods are located in sort of the downtown or city core areas that are really becoming extremely expensive to live. Both residential and commercial rent is increasing. And so the existing residents and communities who've been there for a long time are being forced out or displaced, either due to the rising cost of rent or because of harassment. And this is an issue that we're seeing all across the country. And so what we're seeing now is new development is being shaped not by the communities that have lived there for a long time, but really to cater to new residents. So now I'm going to share a couple of examples from our network. So we have about 25 organizations that are part of our neighborhoods, and you'll hear a little bit more from Jenny Chen, who can share more about Philadelphia as well. But a couple of examples. So one is from the Southeast Asian Community Alliance, based in Los Angeles, Chinatown. So SICA is really a youth development organization. They serve Southeast Asian youth as well as Latinx youth who are based in Chinatown and surrounding neighborhoods. They didn't start out as a housing organization, but what they realized actually, after talking to their youth members, they realized that a number of the youth were just really facing issues of housing insecurity, and it was impacting their ability to participate in the program. And also, they were saying, well, you're helping us to build our leadership so we can go off to college, and then when we come back, we won't be able to live in the neighborhood anymore. And so the youth actually led a participatory rezoning campaign where they reached out to different members of the community. They conducted surveys in several different languages. And it was really something that a number of sort of the experts in planning folks didn't expect, because they advocated, what they realized was at the time, sort of the common knowledge around housing was it would be better to build sort of medium income, so not very affordable housing at a higher percentage. And that was sort of the way that inclusionary zoning was being done in LA at the time. And the youth were really the ones who were guiding this decision-making process. And so they actually advocated and were the ones to say, well, actually, our families are extremely low income. Many of whom were making, less than $15,000 a year. And so it didn't matter whether or not they had more units that served middle income households. The fact was they needed some that could serve the existing communities. And so they advocated to have less units, but more deeply affordable units. And this actually became the basis for the first, extremely low income housing policy in LA that became a model for other transit-oriented development in the city. And now, so on the right, you can see that's a workshop that's being led by some of the youth. And now they're continuing to advocate. So they're part of a 2022 People's Plan. Second example is the Oakland Chinatown Coalition. So two of our network members, Asian Pacific Environmental Network and AAPI, began mobilizing against the Oakland A's stadium being built in Chinatown. So really, once they heard about this development, they talked to some of the organizers based in Seattle who had had an experience with the Kingdom development. And they knew that they didn't want a stadium to be developed in their community. So they mobilized at hearings, they wrote op-eds, there was a lot of media coverage, and they were actually able to block the stadium from being built in their community. Unfortunately, it was actually built next door in West Oakland, which is a predominantly like Black and Latinx neighborhood that's also at risk of gentrification. So a victory, but only a short-term victory, because now, the same organizers are now organizing around community benefits to be able to have the stadium in West Oakland really serve that community as well. And then the third example is, are we missing Chaya? Oh no. Well, I'll just share about it verbally. I'm not sure what happened with that slide, but Chaya CDC is the only community development organization in the country that serves South Asian and Indo-Caribbean communities. And so they were dealing, so they're based in Jackson Heights, Queens, which is one of the most diverse zip codes in the country. And the issue that they were facing is that many immigrant renters were living in illegal basement apartments. And so because these are outlawed by the city, if there was an issue between the landlord and tenant, even if the tenant was facing poor conditions, they would actually be evicted by the city because of the unit being an illegal unit. And so Chaya, along with other partner organizations, started the Basement Apartment Safe for Everyone campaign to advocate for an accessory dwelling unit conversion program. And they were able to actually win city money for a pilot project. However, there was a loss in that in years later, they actually lost the funding for the pilot. So now now they are organizing again in 2022 around the same accessory dwelling unit campaign. So I thought that I would kind of share just some collective learnings from these campaigns and the different organizations that we work with. So in all three examples, this is really like community-based, community-led planning efforts. So all three organizations started by centering the needs of the communities that they're working with. And the policy strategies were developed based on understanding the unique impact of gentrification on these communities. Second, they all engaged in language and culturally specific organizing to be able to actually reach and meet with those communities. They already speak to people in the languages that they speak. They know where people gather culturally. A third theme is that they all focused on building resident leadership. And this is really important because actually in all of the campaigns that I mentioned, even if there were victories, they were often kind of short-lived victories. And so building leadership for the long term has been a really important part of the organizing strategy. And part of this has actually meant educating community members about land use policies and different processes. The fourth is really, centering those impacted community members in decision making. So in a lot of times in planning processes, community members can get lost, at a table with like a lot of different stakeholders. But in this case, the residents themselves were really the ones who were being involved in the decision making around the type of campaign that was being led. And last year, I already mentioned this, that these were multi-year fights. And so as a result, the leadership is important for the long haul. And so as planners, what are some of the lessons that you can take away? And this is something that, whether you also work in the nonprofit sector or in the public sector or private sector, just thinking about how to engage with our community in different ways. One best practice is in providing in language and culturally specific engagement. So providing interpretation and translation for community members, being able to host planning sessions at locations that are accessible to residents. I've been in situations where people have had to travel over an hour to go to a hearing in another part of the city that's about, someone in Queens has to go to Manhattan to speak about something that's happening in their neighborhood. Providing transportation, childcare, or offering, grants to organizations who do the work of turning out community members to these types of events. Choosing trusted messengers from the community. So whenever possible, partnering with existing community-based organizations, such as members of the Armed Neighborhoods Network. Centering impacted community members in decision-making. And really, this is something where, oftentimes traditional planning practices will bring together community members as one stakeholder among many in a neighborhood. But as we're thinking about racial equity and in particular wanting to address the past harm that has been caused by, that equity really requires centering those most marginalized in the process versus treating them like one of many stakeholders that all need to be treated equally. And then having a transparent process and being able to help community members find information. So one of the things that we've included in the toolkit is actually just a brief explainer about the development process and where can you go to actually find information about a proposed development. And then lastly, addressing past harm and racial injustice. And there are some examples. So Seattle's Equitable Development Initiative is one where they're actually providing funding for BIPOC-led organizations to be able to build development that's needed for their communities and community land stewardship efforts. So I'll stop here. I just wanted to end with some resources, including our toolkit. We have a report that's focused on anti-displacement strategies, as well as a small business report. Tending Our Roots is National Capacity's creative placemaking and creative placekeeping program that's focused on arts and culture work. And coming this fall, we'll have a new report on the needs of Asian American renters. And then I've included on the next slide some more information about the organizations that I mentioned, SICA, APEN, APAL, and CHIA CDC. And lastly, we would like to invite you to our convention, which is happening July 11th through 13th in Seattle, Washington. Okay, I'll pass it on to Jenny now.
Great, thanks, Anjan. Hey everyone, my name is Jenny Chen. I use she, her pronouns, and I really appreciate being included in this panel today. I'm going to be speaking about Viet Lead and our anti-displacement organizing work to protect Washington Avenue. Next slide, please. So like Anjan, I want to just begin by acknowledging that the land that's the focus of Viet Lead's work is on the ancestral lands of the Lenni Lenape people. And we take this moment to honor the original caretakers of this land and recognize the histories of violence, erasure, and oppression that have brought us together today. Next slide, please. So during my presentation, I'm going to share a little about me and what's brought me to this work. I'll talk about the historic and present conditions that we are dealing with today in Philly. I'll share about the anti-displacement campaigns that I've had the opportunity to support, and then like Anjan, share some reflection questions for you all as planners. All right, so first, what is my positionality in anti-displacement work? As a quick summary, positionality basically challenges this idea of a values-free approach to research. And I think it also applies really well to planning, where I think we're often pressured to be neutral, these neutral mediators that don't have any of our own biases or perspectives or sometimes even morals. And instead of positionality is arguing that our identities really influence how we understand the world. And it has us ask ourselves, who am I and why am I pursuing this work? So for me, I grew up as one of a handful of Asian Americans in a mostly white suburb of Philly. And because of that, I had access to what was basically a treasure trove of public resources, including really high quality education, a sense of public safety, really well-maintained public spaces. But at the same time, I also experienced this really deep sense of isolation. I noticed this, especially with my parents, who really weren't, they didn't interact with our neighbors, they weren't involved in any kind of local political processes. And it wasn't until I moved to Philly for college that I witnessed and experienced the just intense resource disparities in the city, and also found a political home among Asian American and immigrant communities who were really actively building power and organizing with other communities of color to defend public institutions and really prioritize the needs of low-income residents. So it's with these experiences that I came to volunteer with Viet Lead and their anti-displacement campaign. Sorry, next slide. Great, so next slide. So Viet Lead was founded in 2015. They serve the Viet and Southeast Asian communities in Philly and South Jersey. And the organization's mission is to develop leadership in the Vietnamese community in solidarity with other communities of color towards improving health, increasing self-determination, and strengthening political power. And in Philadelphia, the organization's base is primarily in South Philly, which is where we've organized small business owners, particularly on Washington Avenue, which is highlighted on that map. Next slide, please. So as context, Washington Avenue, it's a major thoroughfare in our city, a little over 2 miles long. And as you can see on this map, it passes through some of our city's most diverse zip codes. Next slide, please. And so the corridor, it's always been, and it continues to be really mixed. It's industrial, commercial, it's also a community hub. It has a lot of significance in the Vietnamese and Asian communities in Philly because of the temples and the many Asian plazas that are home to supermarkets, different specialty goods stores, restaurants, and other small businesses. Next slide, please. So echoing what Anjan talked about, when we think about the recent challenges of gentrification and displacement, we really have to start with understanding the history and the historical development of the neighborhood. And starting in the 1800s, Washington Avenue was a major industrial corridor. There were coal yards and steel companies, manufacturers that lined the street. And as a result, the neighborhoods around Washington Avenue are made up of dense row homes, which provided housing for immigrant and migrant workers. First, that was mostly Italian workers, and then following the Great Migration, Black workers from the South. And because the neighborhood was mixed, because it was working class, it was identified as high risk by government agencies and private lenders and investors. And this is exemplified by the Federal Homeowners Loan Corporation rating of the area. So our South Philly neighborhoods, despite being really busy with industry, providing thousands of jobs, they were rated the lowest because Italian immigrants and Black people called it home. And so this meant for decades that public and private dollars that could have supported homeowners and built wealth and public services just weren't coming to this area. Next slide, please. So this investment basically got exacerbated by deindustrialization that started in the 70s. And for South Philly, it led to major population loss among white folks who could more easily access housing in other neighborhoods. And so factories shut down, there's a lot of vacancy, And during these same decades, there were major waves of immigration, and mostly from Mexico and Vietnam, people coming to this country as economic and wartime refugees. And a lot of them were settled in South Philly neighborhoods. Starting in the 80s, Asian immigrants really got to re-envision what Washington Avenue could be. They created shopping plazas to meet community needs for culturally relevant foods, different services, and they created spaces where people have been gathering and celebrating for decades. And the very first of these plazas was Hua Bin Plaza. A picture of it's on the bottom right, which translates to Peace Plaza. Next slide. So this history has today created this major struggle about, whose vision and version of Washington Avenue matters. And with the suppressed home values and wages that are in the area, again, created by decades of government policy and these global economic changes, all of this has basically paved the way for developers to buy a property and displace longtime residents and small businesses. And actually, the 19146 zip code that the corridor runs through was identified as one of the top 10 gentrifying neighborhoods in the country. And home sale prices, we've seen them increase by 5 times. That's probably higher nowadays. Over the past 10 years, we've just seen crazy changes happen in the community. Next slide, please. And so this has also dramatically changed the racial makeup of the neighborhood as well. There's been an increase in immigrant populations, but there's been a significant loss of Black residents. And new developments are essentially catering to wealthier, typically white residents, like this on the right-hand side, this picture of a huge mixed-use building that was built just a block away from Hua Bin Plaza. And again, we don't consider these changes, inevitable or natural, and instead really understand them as a continuation of developer-friendly policies that keep prioritizing profit over working class people, and especially people of color. Next slide, please. Great, so I'll talk about the campaign. And so, again, this challenge of whose vision matters really played out at Hua Bin Plaza, where business owners have been displaced because of pressures from a private developer, Streamline. And like I mentioned, the plaza has been really important historically and culturally for residents in South Philly, also regionally. There were 10 small businesses in the plaza. They employed more than 50 people. It was a place where people got food and had weddings and, bought, used phone and telecommunications to communicate with their families overseas. And this developer, instead of recognizing the plaza as this critical community resource, really just saw it as an opportunity to make profit. And so they're proposing to replace what they've called a dilapidated building with this, on the bottom 2 images, luxury housing and a huge apartment complex. Next slide, please. And so the small business owners there actually didn't even hear about the plans that Streamline had until they saw it on the news. And so that's when Be It Lead got involved to organize the business owners and organize a campaign to save Hua Bin. And staff and volunteers, they brought community members as well as our local council person together to make it clear that we wanted the businesses protected from displacement. And during the first year of the campaign, we got petitions signed, we raised money for legal funds, we learned about the zoning and permitting process, and we realized just how developer-friendly the planning and building process is in the city. Basically, on 3 separate times, Streamline was able to delay a hearing that would have likely led to their project being rejected because we organized such a strong show of opposition. And these delay tactics are totally legal. They're certainly driving gentrification here and in other parts of the city. In the meantime, the business owners were feeling really unstable, dealing with the added stress of just not knowing what was going to happen next. Next slide, please. So back in December of 2019, the plaza owner gave the small businesses eviction notices that would go into effect February 2020, which is a month before the pandemic lockdowns. And so Be It Lead organized our annual Tet or Lunar New Year celebration as a block party on the parking lot in the plaza. We pushed to delay this eviction. We tried to urge Streamline to come to the table after almost half a year of silence from them. But because the businesses had month-to-month agreements, we were only able to delay their direct displacement until May 2020. And some of the businesses that were able to relocate, others are permanently closed, so there's been a big gap on the corridor. And, you know, again, I think Anjan mentioned this too, just as a testament to leadership development, to relationship building. The business owners have actually still remained dedicated to fighting Streamline. And we've advocated on their behalf to negotiate a community benefits agreement, but the developers refusing to address the harms that they caused, and they're now trying to go a legislative route to get their permits. So basically, we're witnessing that the current planning and development context basically gives developers chance after chance to push their proposals through. And even though there were 2 community meetings where we organized opposition votes, Streamline could feasibly come back and have a slightly modified design and sort of put us through all of this again. So really, we see a need in our city, I'm sure in other cities too, to transform how land is used and how the development process actually meets our community's needs. And so on this slide, in the context of this, despite, again, just as this is one building, one parcel, we're also grappling with this larger transportation effort, planning effort, to repave Washington Avenue and change it from a 5-lane corridor to instead be either 3, 4, or 5 lanes, kind of depending on where you are. And we obviously support efforts to improve safety and traffic safety. But in this effort, we've seen our transportation department really leave out the voices of Black residents and small business owners in South Philly who rely on the corridor as an evacuation route, as a place for commercial trucks to be able to unload. And so we've supported the Black-led Save Washington Avenue Coalition as they try to organize to maintain the 5-lane design and utilize proven safety measures. Next slide, please. And so in this planning process, we've essentially seen mostly white, really well-resourced advocates kind of be pitted against long-term Black residents. And in the meantime, our city's transportation planners, they've fallen back on arguments of safety and claim that others are responsible for any gentrifying effects their plan may have. But if we don't have planners or others in the city kind of taking any responsibility for the rampant gentrification that's happening, we as community members and as organizers, we have few leverage points really to plan for and create the neighborhoods that we need and that we deserve. And we're proud of the Hwaben business owners, really grateful for the community organizers who've taught us in this fight. And we really want and need the same bravery from our city officials and other planners in our city and across this country to address these root causes and repair historic inequities. So with that, next slide. I just want to close with some reflection questions for you all as planners. And the first is, how do we balance using the tools that we have right now that we know are limiting versus pushing for transformative change that we know we need? And we also know that, like Anjan mentioned, not all voices are the same, not all voices should be treated the same. And so how do we actually, at the beginning of planning processes, design processes, really create decision-making frameworks that address these historic and ongoing inequities? So thank you for your attention. I'm going to pass the mic now to Eddie.
Right. Thank you, Jenny. And thank you, Anjan and Jenny, because you've had some really great examples that we can build upon. I'm not sure who here is on this session is a planner, but my hope is twofold for this portion of our panel, because I want to take a step back and think about how we ask questions. So my hope here is, one, first, if you're a planner, I want to challenge you to think about how you ask questions, what you provide for your basis in planning, and if this resonates with you, great. If you already asked the same question I am, all the better, but I want to challenge you. And for our non-planners, I want you to think about the questions I'm asking, because as you work with your community, especially if you're a community organizer, planners come from different backgrounds, and maybe one way to engage with them differently is think about how you're asking questions to these planners as you work to build consensus in your communities. Next. And with that, let's get started. So we heard a lot about what are some of today's planning challenges. We heard from Anjan, rising rent affect neighborhood stability. These affect everything from residences to small mom and pop shops. I was just in Los Angeles visiting friends a month ago, and I went back to where I normally hung out in Little Tokyo and saw the shops, and they have all shifted. And I gathered from this conversation with the store owners that the rents were too high, and there was really no a way to really address those issues. And so we know these are existing problems. But there are also then offset effects when we think about how these existing problems affect the way we would plan. And there are intergenerational effects it has. Questions that come to mind are where the best district, that should be in quotation marks, because that affects not only the neighborhood identity, but their sense of pride. And in a way that affects how vocal some people may be. There's also looking at future generation social mobility as well. And so how does it affect education, for example? And of course, there's the aspect of social resiliency. With all these then go together and really go back to what Jenny was asking in her challenge of the planners. And next, please. So what's in the toolbox to address these issues? Well, there's everything from tax exemptions, dealing with what I mentioned about the rent issue, looking at zoning to do with displacement, cultural preservation, dealing with the aspect of identity, community benefit agreement for local employment, and education job training to retain the people there who live there. There's in-language tenant counseling, particularly important when you think about when people are displaced, how that affects social resiliency. You know, growing up, I had lived in a community where there were a lot of Chinese Americans, and my mom would actually force my sister and I to go and help translate for people who were going to the doctor and so forth. So there's much to be said about the cohesion of community. But the thing is that the plan is when we take a step back and we think about all these tools is, which one do I choose? Planners are trained very classically, either from a standpoint of thinking about a place or about people. And sometimes we overlap, but when I guest lecture at a local university, then I speak with planning students, they really could veer towards one way or the other. I want you guys to think about this with a policy box and in relation to the planning challenges, because you can categorize these. They do fit more towards one or the other. And that should really affect how you begin to ask the questions. And so we think about the question, next slide, please. There are three major lessons I thought you guys think about throughout the course of this presentation. And that the first one is, how do you achieve purpose and intent in planning? Especially with dealing with working with a minority community, or even understanding individual perspectives. Second lesson, think about how we formalize space and voices. And third, and I won't speak about this as much, but I'll touch upon it more because my prior two speakers on the panel have really touched a lot on the social network. All these three lessons provide very vital clues for how we should be phrasing and thinking about questions. Next, please. But before we dig in too deep, a little bit about my background. I immigrated to the U.S. when I was 3. I was born in Hong Kong. I'm Chinese American. I grew up in Rhode Island. Not exactly the place you would expect someone from Hong Kong to end up, but we got there because my aunt married my uncle, and my family just got pulled across in chain migration. We had a family business, and a couple of years later, I had two younger siblings who were born in the U.S. Don't really speak an ounce of Chinese; they're only English. Obviously, you can tell I spent a lot of money on expensive pieces of paper. I have a bachelor's and two masters, and I'm a planner by trade, so I think about how people react, and I think about how families interact with their community. Next, please. There's more than one reason why I told you about this background, because there's a lot of perceptions I get as a planner, particularly as an Asian American or Chinese planner, where the model minority, there are folks who feel like they can relate to me and those that feel like they can't, and it's pretty evident in a lot of public meetings. But beyond that, we're not really all that different. Everything I mentioned in the prior slide points to a demographic or a category of fact. The fact that I was an immigrant, my family side that you saw in the picture, my language, speak Chinese at home, my ethnicity, the fact that with chain migration, though I grew up in a place where there was an ethnic cluster of sorts, my education, the social background. And I don't know about you all, but in my experience as planners, we tend to gloss over some of these items. We take them in very categorical terms, but every category listed above provides insight of community needs. And if you think about if you have or lack on certain these items, every category listed above poses questions of barriers or opportunities. And this is important because we forget to talk to people personally when we think about these projects. And I can't count how many times planners just categorize these items like, oh wait, this is the general demographics. But when you walk, when I walk in the community and I talk to individuals, not just those who are the most vocal, you may think I'm just having a normal conversation, but I'm actually checking off every one of these bullets. And I know it sounds really creepy, but it actually helped me as a planner because understanding if I need to think about translation services, if I need to think about where the economic base is, these all come through. And I root myself in my identity, in my background, and Asian American or Chinese American planner because it reminds me of these categories I have to look out for each individual. And this is also important because when we think about how we plan with purpose and intent, we have to consider this, and you'll hear me repeat this. Targeted interventions require targeted understanding. Next, please. And so we think about these questions then of how we create an understanding, a base understanding. These various items come to play. Just a really basic question is, when we think about these policies and these programs, is who is this for? Who invests? Who demands and who benefits, and who stays and who goes. And this is important when we think about public policy, because all of planning is a public policy exercise. And the root core of good public policy exercise is how do you generate the most good without creating harm? And this is important when we think about the idea of gentrification and displacement because of many of the policies that we have that you saw in the toolbox revolve around the concept of value generation and equity. We're afraid to ask these questions sometimes also because it makes one group or another tend to be a bad guy. I'll go to an example on the next slide. We can go to the next slide of a local example in North Miami, where they went through and they tried to do a master plan to assess market conditions along a corridor. There's the Northwest 7th Avenue down in South Florida. And here they wanted to establish a guideline focused on a Chinese motif and architectural elements, encourage capital projects, and recommendations to create an innovation district focused on art, culture, research, and technology. It could be a new Chinatown. Except they're only doing this because they want the Chinese dollars or investment. So when you look to the background of the area is predominantly Haitian American. There may be 2 or 3 Chinese businesses in a 90 acres study area. So I look back at it and I had to ask, who are we creating opportunity for and who to expect? And it's not a comfortable question, but one that needs to be asked. But what I really, in retrospect, should have been asking, and I want you guys to consider is this, let's replace the word Chinatown with Little Haiti. Let's replace also the word Haitian American on my slide with Chinese American. Do those questions change? Well, when I put it like that, you would say, no, I mean, this is a self-selecting group. But when after application, in my experience, the answer from the general public is generally yes. And so it speaks to the inherent bias that we have and the need to ask these questions and flip the questions on their head. At the end of the day, though, planning for Asian American communities and for other minority communities, including Haitian American and so forth, as I experienced in planning in my region, we still revolve around the same questions. We just, for some reason, tend to treat them with a little bit different and bias and approach that's subtle. And of course, we go to the next slide, speaking of the same example and segueing from it. There is how we approach these the planning exercises here. Here we have this really okay, so we were planning on this presentation, and I actually looked this up, and our other panelists know that I had put this project on full blast because I was really appalled by this. I was appalled by this because of what it meant to me from the standpoint of place, of visual ID. And I'm going to pose a question for you all to think about, because I'll come back to it, is what creates a place? What creates an identity? Is it natural or organic? And maybe why did I find this offensive? I'll let you guys do in that a little bit as we go forward. Next, please. Meanwhile, next door, we didn't have the, we still have a Haitian American population, but we also have a Asian and Pacific Islander, Asian American and Pacific Islander population in North Miami Beach, where I served as the interim planning director for a while. And during my tenure there, as the planning director, we actually finalized a district called the International Boulevard. This was very multicultural, it's mixed use. There are many ethnic businesses, including mom and pop stores, but this was all organically grown. I found it interesting though, because we looked at this place and we're like, well, there's definitely an impetus for Chinatown. There were, I had to do a listing for the mayor for an event, and I counted in half an hour no less than I think 30 Chinese American businesses either owned a restaurant and so forth in a short stretch of the neighborhood. So it's organically grown, but in discussion of whether we should name it, we settled on International Boulevard. And I'll come back to this in a little bit also as well. I just want you to think about that, because we, we have all these businesses here. And if we go to the next slide, after this, I have to ask a question: what is too far and what is not enough? Or if you click next, are we using the right tactic but in the wrong, with the wrong application? I was really offended by the North Miami example that you see on the left because it felt like it was appropriation. And it felt like we're displacing one minority in favor of another. Also, thinking about it from a planning standpoint about what gives a place identity and why do people gather, and if that investment was really achieving what we should be in a community. You know, and we go back one slide actually. We had these businesses were helped in various forms, some way, either with zoning, with CRA facade improvement monies, like the restaurant on the bottom left. But if we go back to the slide, to the next slide, we have a community that still said, well, these are organically grown, but we're still going to label it the International Boulevard. So what is too far? Why not just call it Chinatown? Why not just give it a specific name and identity? How much is too far, and how much isn't far enough? Keep going. Go back to keep going forward. Oh, we're doing backwards. Sorry. There we go. And it really speaks to the question for me of how we formalize space and formal identity. What gives the place identity, and why do people gather? You know, in the former example with North Miami Beach, we had a place that was given a name, very specific name, Chinatown, whether that was apt or not, with visuals on the architecture that speak to the cultural art, even if it ran a little hollow, despite a lack of history. And the latter, we didn't really have the name or the visuals, but we had a situation that was very supportive of potential community gathering areas, a market, eating places, parks, religious institutions, even the streets. And that's important because we seem to have instances where we separate the two of those quite often in planning, one based on marketing, the other based on people. Again, back to what I mentioned very early on about how we have two aspects in planning. You have planning for place and planning for people, and sometimes there's a disconnect. And so you do have to ask the question of what gives that place identity and why do people gather? Because, next slide, please. Target interventions require targeted understanding. So why do people gather? People gather because of familiarity, because of curiosity, particularly important for marketing and trying to get people to invest in an area sometimes, or just spend their money there. They also gather because of relationships, shared experiences, security, and belonging. Steve, you know, from my example with my family. There's no, I don't, you know, when we talk about planning and things occurring organically, that's where that comes into play with the organic development of businesses. There's a sub portion of that that occurred as well, that when you understand the motivations about why someone is there, and you can pinpoint the aspects of belonging, relationships, you create an understanding of the planner of the social network. And part of that is who is trusted and who trusts, who supports. Why it's important? Well, because we don't always plan with having the benefit of having the community organizations that are wonderful, you know, the type of organizations that Anjan and Jenny and the great stuff they bring to the table. But what we have to do as planners is understand that in the absence of those organizations, it doesn't mean there isn't an underlying voice that's based on identity. And when you're able to understand that social net that's underneath, you're able to identify the champions. And next, please. And why it's important? When you think about the question, you can create the policies that are in place to think about the name as the identity of place. you think about the community gathering areas, and you think about the motivations of place. And when you do those, you can put in policies that formalize the space, that give it a name, a district, and then you can craft policies around them that target specifically the identity or the need of the individual and the business and identity. We saw a lot of tools in there when we first started about thinking about tax abatement and facade improvement to a point. But is it really enough? Well, no, because we actually get it wrong a lot of the time. A lot of times, like we have with the North Miami example, taken anywhere else, we're really just looking at the facade. And in doing so, we've forgotten about the cultural, residential, and commercial needs. So the program, when you think about just facade or architectural in nature, may not be great for dealing with the planning issues we mentioned earlier. How do we deal with rent? How do we deal with the commercial aspect? I mean, when you look at the pictures, one from LA on the top and the business I noted on the bottom, I mean, you know what, on the bottom, I couldn't tell it was in a Chinatown, but you know what, I can target specific businesses with a CRA program or some other program and help that business deal with maybe something they're lacking either with rent or a improvement they need to meet the code. And that's important. When you formalize the space and identity, again, it gives people a voice. And we have to be able to distinguish where we're putting the money. So, way back in the, where I said who this for, who invests, who demands, and who benefits. That's the beginning question. And then you build upon that when you formalize the space and you think about where you put these in to play. And when you look at every community is different, but the questions remain the same. With limited resources, what do we protect? And is it superficial? Sometimes, like in my first example, it is, but it doesn't mean you can't pivot off of it, because it should give you an understanding of where you have to ask the question a bit differently to understand where the building blocks of the community are and identify the pieces that are being threatened, whether it's a gathering place or the history. You have to really think carefully about what preserves eliminate culture and identity, because it's more than just the facade. It is about the people's ability to gather, about the market, the eating place, the park, religious institutions. And it's about those, understand the nuances in that aspect of questioning for targeted understanding, because at the end of the day, you do have to create lasting change through the identification of current and future champions. And next, please. So I try to keep it really short and just get some targeted questions. Again, thinking about what you heard in the beginning, what you heard throughout, I pose the question to you: which one do you choose? There's a lot of policies in the toolbox, and they all look very attractive, but you have to put in a good base understanding in order to solve these problems. And when you do so, the next and final slide is, the lesson here and here is, in order to create purpose and intent in planning, you have to have a good basis. You have to ask the right questions. You have to ask the uncomfortable questions as well. And you have to ask the questions that really lend itself to identity and not just from a physical standpoint or just purely an individual standpoint. You have to understand the motivations of place and motivations of the policy. And of course, when you do so, and you can connect with people, you can then understand how a policy works and incorporate the social network into the planning that you're doing. And with that, hopefully that was a short, different look at maybe looking at how you deal with the questions and you take great answers.
Great. Thank you, Eddie, and thank you, Anjan and Jenny, for your presentations. This is a good time for you all to take a breather before we jump into the Q&A. I know we had invited you all to share your questions or comments in the chat. I haven't seen any, but definitely feel free to filter those in as we give our three speakers a few seconds to take a rest or a sip of water before we jump into the Q&A. But yeah, thank you for your insights.
Todd,
Yes.
there is one under the question panel. There is one question from Darren.
Oh, okay. Okay, great. I will jump to that in just a second. I just gotta find it.
Do you see it?
Let's see.
Do you want me to read
It's under
it?
the questions poll or panel.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, I see it. Is it to identify? Okay. I will. I just gotta copy and paste it. I will put it in the chat too, just so people can see it if they don't see the questions panel. So the question that was raised was to identify a space's identity beyond the facade. How do you collect the information of who is in that location and who is represented? Do you send out surveys to residents, observations in public spaces? I will open that up to any of the panelists if they wish to speak upon that.
I'll give it
Eddie, I think you're still muted.
Yeah, there's a little lag as I'm trying to mute and unmute crypto. Well, I like to walk a place and just talk with individuals, and not just individuals who are just in the public space. I think you need to have a targeted plan always. So, especially not just regardless of whatever you're doing, always think about the business owners, always think about a resident, always think about a visitor. So yeah, you can send out surveys to residents, but sometimes in doing so, you don't get the visitor aspect. And I think it's also important for an AAPI community because sometimes they are regional draws. Like, you know, I grew up in Rhode Island and I went to Boston all the time, went to that kind of town all the time. You can also, I think your question ending in updates in public spaces is also important because you can actually learn a lot just by seeing, just by sitting there and just observing. And of course, make sure to, you know, talk to people of all different ages because there are generational differences, even in what I see in my family on how my younger siblings, who may be Chinese American but are very Americanized, they react, and where I, as a first generation immigrant, and even my parents who were older, might react as well. Past that, also consider just a baseline interview, baseline information before you go there in person. Definitely think about you know, using census data to understand what the demographics of the place you're going into, and if there are other surveys that have already existed, because you know, even those sources like the census don't really break down. Is it you know, in a large community, there's Chinese American, there's the Vietnamese, the Thai, there's you know, Samoan, there's Hawaiian. So be cognizant of that as well, I would say.
I really appreciate Eddie's like practical methods for answering this question. And I think I'll just add that, you know, it's very rare that a place has a singular identity, and I think there is definitely going to be competing interests and narratives, and even histories that get shared in this process. And so I think, again, I'll just like go back to my question about how either at the beginning or throughout are you kind of weighing and ultimately going to be making or landing on decisions, either with, hopefully with, possibly for communities. And as an example, with the Washington Avenue transportation planning work that's going on, there's, you know, a lot of new residents who would love the identity of this corridor to be like this very walkable, like outdoor cafes everywhere, really swanky kind of place and like a lot of residential mixed use properties, which I think, I mean, I just remember in planning school, that is also the sort of like vision that keeps getting put forth as like, this is what a city community means and should look like. And then you have the voices of long-term Black residents, small business owners who see it very differently and really see it as like an economic and kind of a space for jobs, job opportunities, a place where, you know, historically they've come for those kind of resources and have used cars to get there. And when those things compete, do we as planners just like go with majority voice? And right, like even if you do something like polling, which seems very fair and open, if you do it only online, like who actually has access to that, who knows to navigate that and can share really quickly in their own communities, I think are important questions to ask as you do figure out how you answer those questions you have.
Great, thanks, Jenny. Thanks, Eddie, for those remarks. The second question that we got in the question chat area was, organizing groups keep having to fight lots of the same fights that hop around. What can planners do to help change the systemic issue of displacement? Thank you for that question.
I think we can tag team on this one, right, Jenny, Anjan? If you want to go first, and then I'll give my planner's perspective after. You take two sides of this question.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I mean, I was just going to also kind of piggyback off of what you all were just sharing and the question about the facades, because I think that a lot of times planning and planning tools like have a lot of emphasis on, and this is as somebody who is not an urban planner by training, it is somebody who is a community organizer and had to learn planning just kind of by way of advocating for the community. So, but I do think that there is a large emphasis on built form and like assuming that, you know, changes to a facade or changes to almost like superficial changes, they haven't had the result that we've wanted them to. So an example being like here in DC's Chinatown, where, you know, there's a requirement that signage be translated into Chinese, and now it's like Chipotle that is translated into Chinese. So I just think that for gentrification to really be addressed, the planning tools that we use need to actually be ones that have teeth in terms of policy change. And some of the ones, Eddie, that you mentioned, like, you know, actually having tenant protection policy be part of these changes. And then also really thinking about equity in the process and centering the voices of community members who have historically been in the neighborhood for longer. Yeah, that's what I would say. And yeah, and I think that the example, Eddie, that you shared of where it's really like almost like a Chinatown that's being used to displace Black and Haitian residents, you know, that is the exact opposite of what a planner should be doing, you know, is really thinking about who is already in the community and centering those people rather than imposing your own agenda.
I want to go back to the kind of questions I raised during the presentation and kind of leap off of that. You know, who benefits? Who is it for? And I agree that I asked those questions because when we think about policy intervention, you know, we touched upon facade, but ultimately, when we think about gentrification and displacement, you have to think about the financial impact. And that means you have to dig into the understanding of the economic structure of an individual household, economic structure, the financial structure of a business, and craft the resulting policy accordingly. Now, this doesn't mean that you can't tackle it from a physical standpoint, because sometimes, you know, you can't necessarily affect the market price of, say, a unit, a housing unit, but you could provide for differences in unit sizes or subsidies and so forth, and, you know, other protections as well. I think, you know, sometimes gentrification and displacement also result from that loss of that social resiliency. So it's a chain, a cascading aspect. So sometimes formalizing the space not only gives you that identity that you can then hang your hat on in terms of policies that are targeted for that particular district, but also says a lot about how you can keep the communities cohesive and supportive of each other. It's the two sides of the same coin, really.
Yeah, I really appreciate what y'all have been sharing and completely agree that that beyond the physical, right, there is a need for planners to, and I think understandably, like when we learn about the history of planning, and just in so many cases, I think honestly the overreach that's happened, and the way that planners have, you know, torn up huge areas of cities, and I think there's like a lot of planners guilt. I don't know if others feel it, but that we adopt by being in this field, and I think there's, you know, it's attractive to want to just be like, or like the approach of like not like being really hands off or like taking a really soft position or like trying to be neutral. I think is really tempting, and I think also, like we experienced in Bobbin Plaza, when we try to reach out to our state planning commission to get their support and advocacy, I think at most they said all they could do was give a letter of like saying that they supported the plaza and its existence, but like really, like Anjan said, like didn't have much more teeth than that. So how do we make sure that people and planners who really value equity, and who do want to address these issues, like really exert their power, like please exert your power, and, you know, learn from organizers, like be organizers yourself. I think like, unfortunately, there's like this like split identity that I don't think has to exist. I think it's really more of a question of like, who are we doing our work in service of? Are we serving our employer, like if it's a city agency or a county agency, or is it the clients who pay us, or is it the communities that we're doing our work in, and within communities, like who within those communities are we considering and prioritizing? And I think those are really hard questions, and I think it's good for yourself personally figure out like values, and again, this idea of positionality, would definitely encourage, if you haven't like kind of considered that for yourself, to do so, and then, I mean, apply that to wherever you work, and, you know, I think it's really more common within like nonprofit organizations or like community-based organizations to think about like a theory of change, or what is our, what are our guiding values and how do those get played out? And I think it would be really important for public agencies, policymakers, planners to do the same.
Yeah. I would say, Jenny, what I agree with what you and Anjan do is, as a planner, is really you ask the tougher question as community organizers. planners don't necessarily subscribe to that. We're afraid that if we ask it, sometimes I think we're afraid if we ask the wrong question, we make one group out to be the bad guys. Which is why I don't, I know it's a 4 question on a slide about who benefits and who stays and who goes. We don't really ask that often in my experience because it makes someone the bad guy. So maybe part of it is how we deal with the displacement and against dealing with our underlying trappings is how we deal with that aspect of what makes someone uncomfortable. I mean, I know even preparing for this presentation, I'm gonna have to remind me, like, sometimes you have to ask the tough question because that was, that you maybe discomfort creates that change. And so maybe that's part of the lesson that our attendees can take away from both of your work as well.
I appreciate that, Eddie. I will say, I think a lot of planners, I think it takes time and evolution. I mean, in learning this a lot from community organizing work of just like, when we think about what it takes to transform something, transform a system, transform a policy, we don't go from like 0 to 100 in like a second, right? And if we think about the, conversations about abolition and reparations were like impossible to have in a really broad scale like they are now, like even just 10 years ago. So like those, like we need the incremental kind of shifts to happen and those, those brave conversations to happen and those questions to be asked. And I will also say, if you're worried that asking a question is going to make someone come off like a bad person or the bad guy, like probably their actions and their impacts are what's doing it, not your question asking. So don't be afraid to to do that.
Yeah, and
Thank you for. Oh, go ahead, Dungeon.
Oh, sorry. I think there's a lag on my end. No, I was just going to say about this thing about being neutral. Like, I think that you can sometimes get caught up in that and wanting to be neutral. But I think if we look at, and that's why I kind of brought in that slide about the history of planning and just thinking about what is the history of planning and how, it's never been neutral. It's really always centered, really a white supremacy agenda. And planning was really used to say, this is where white people can live and people of color can't live here. And that was one of its, main purposes. It may not have been stated as a purpose, but that's how it was used. And so now is a time when you can undo some of that with with actions moving towards equity and that like reparative justice piece that Jenny was talking about. So like, how can we think about equity as being part of that reparative justice process?
Great. Thank you all. I'm just looking at the time and we're at 3:26 Eastern time. So we're almost at the 90-minute mark. We want to respect everyone's time in terms of keeping to that 90 minutes as best as possible. I think APA Florida EDI committee wanted to close us out. And I see another question popped up, but I want to hand it over to Bob or Lindsay, I forget. I think it was Bob, to close us out. And if we do have time for that last question, we can squeeze it in. Otherwise, I'll let Bob.
What I was Bob, this is Bob. I'm going to very quickly say thank you, everyone, for coming. My name is Bob Cambrick. I'm the co-chair of APA Florida's EDI committee. And I put my email address in the chat. As a follow-up, if you want to get in touch with anyone about when we're going to be posting this and where you're going to be able to find it, you can just send me an email. We'll get you that information. You can also contact Todd or Hing or the interest group. I believe it's Asian Islander Planning at gmail.com. But thank you again. And Todd, if you would, let's see if we can get that question answered because that's important as well. Thank you again, everyone.
Sure. Looks like we have 2 minutes. So the last question from Travion Smith, as a young level entry planner, how have you navigated the micropolitics in the job? In a situation where you may be the only one in the room with a different perspective, how do you speak up and stay true to your values while also acknowledging that you're learning on the job? I'll throw that in the chat too.
Yeah. Well, that's a planner question. I'll take a stab at it, and I think Todd, you might have a perspective yourself as well on this. Well, as a young planner, I think that the best way to remain true to your perspective, to your values, is to hold on to them. Just the way that I've anchored myself and giving you my background, you can always ask the same question to learn some other perspective. And when you begin by acknowledging their perspective and then you add your own, that's when you create a dialogue. You may not always agree, but when you establish that basis in the conversation first, I find that it's easy to manage through any differences you may have, and that helps with navigating the micropolitics of the job. Of course, tact and respect go a long way, as it's hiding behind your senior level planners, as an entry level planner, of course. So I think that's my short bit. I try to keep it. We only have a minute or two. So.
Thanks, Eddie. I guess with that last minute, I think it's probably even less. That's at 3:30 now on my clock. So let's close out. Thank you all for attending. Thank you to APA Florida EDI Committee for co-hosting this with the APA Asian and Pacific Islander Interest Group. We really enjoyed putting it together. This is a recorded webinar, so if you want to check back and look at it again or share it with your colleagues, it'll be posted. It'll probably be shared on APA Interact, the weekly e-newsletter, and hopefully on their website as well. So thank you all for attending. If you have questions that you wanted to follow up with any of the speakers, feel free to email any of us. I put the APA interest group's email in the chat, so you could always email that to us and we can forward it to any or all of the speakers as well. So thank you all.